few weeks ago, the IRS announced churches and other houses of worship can now endorse political candidates during their services and still keep their tax-exempt status. This is a rule that has been in place since 1954, and until now, it was unclear if an endorsement given during a sermon counted as campaign activity. IRS officials say the new policy fixes it. It doesn't count. And in the days since the announcement, people have wondered what this technical change to a rule that was often ignored anyway might mean for religious life in this country. Here in Utah, officials of the LDS Church didn't give a direct comment about the change. A spokesman did clarify the church takes political neutrality very seriously. So it seems clear at least this religious organization isn't going to be endorsing candidates from the pulpit. But the historian Benjamin Park told us it wasn't always that way. There were times, he said, when leaders moved more freely between faith and politics.
In the wake of the 1932 presidential election, Franklin Delano Roosevelt immediately implemented his New Deal, a series of federal interventions to try to pull America out of the Great Depression. Among those who saw this New Deal program as federal overreach was J. Reuben Clark, who had just joined the First Presidency at that very moment. And in his first general conference in April of 1933, he was aghast at seeing several other general authorities of the LDS Church praising FDR's New Deal.
The world is moaning in tribulation. I do not know the cure. The questions involved are so nearly infinite in their vastness that I question whether any human mind can answer them.
So he set out to try to wean the Mormons off of FDR's program.
But it is my faith that if the people shall shun idleness, if they shall cast out from their hearts those twin usurpers, ambition and greed, and then shall re-enthrone brotherly love and return to the old-time virtues, industry, thrift, honesty, self-reliance, independence of spirit, self-discipline, and mutual helpfulness, we shall be far on our way to returned prosperity and worldly happiness.
Four years later, in 1936, when FDR is going up against Alf Landon, the Republican nominee, J. Reuben Clark saw this as dire enough that he and Heber J. Grant were going to issue a statement on the front page of the Deseret News.
The Church and its membership have always stood for constitutional government. They have resisted with all their might every effort to impair it, or to curtail our liberties, or to destroy our free institutions set up and guaranteed by it, no matter where such effort originated or in what disguise it came.
The Constitution or no Constitution, Mormons and Utahns have a choice to vote between someone who respects the Constitution and the separation of powers and someone who is going to abolish America's principles of liberty and freedom.
Church members who believe the revelations and the words of the prophet must stand for the Constitution. Every patriot loving his country and its institutions should feel in duty bound to vote to protect it.
If you are a true believing Latter-day Saint, a lover of freedom, a patriotic American, there's only one choice in the election, and it's the Republican, not FDR. The election comes around the next Tuesday, and Utah overwhelmingly votes for FDR. J. Reuben Clark was both frustrated and undaunted by this response. He was really upset. He thought he was joining a governing body that could shape the Latter-day Saint community and pull them away from the overreach of the federal government. But as disappointed as he was, he knew that he could eventually shape it, even if the results are going to come much later than he expected. So one of the things that J. Reuben Clark does is he overturns the entire editorial board for the Deseret News, who had been Democratic-leaning before the 1930s, and replaced them with conservative voices who start shaping Latter-day Saint discourse. On the one hand, I love this story because it shows the diversity of the Mormon experience. not everyone voted in lockstep with LDS leaders. It also shows the limits of ecclesiastical endorsements for political parties, that just because the leaders are saying you need to vote one way means that the Latter-day Saint lay members are going to follow. But it did lay the foundation for the slow movement of Latter-day Saints away from being a swing party alignment where they voted for Republicans some years, Democrats others, to eventually in the 1960s when you get the social revolution, the civil rights movement, and a number of other cultural tumults. The Latter-day Saints were poised to take advantage of this foundation that J. Reuben Clark and others did to now see the world through a conservative lens.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. What's interesting about that story is, well, there are a few things. First, it raises the question of whether it really makes much of a difference if religious leaders are able to endorse candidates from the pulpit. As Benjamin Park said, whether it changes anything at the moment is not so certain, but at least in the Mormon case, it did make a larger difference to the nature of the church itself later on. He says it changed the church. So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. But the story also seems to be about the role of a church, not just as a space for worship, but as a community of people who have to work out questions of conscience. Do you limit a member's moral autonomy if you tell them how to vote? But if you're a pastor, what's the difference between providing moral guidance and making an endorsement? But before we get there, let's back up to where all this started. This was 70 years ago, and Benjamin Park says America was a different place.
The 1950s was in many ways the climax of Christian nationalism in America. Because in response to the Cold War, where Russia is depicted as this godless socialistic empire. And so in juxtaposition to that, America is supposed to be this godly capitalistic society. That means we need to define our nation in religious values. Now, few people embodied this impulse as Dwight Eisenhower, who's elected to the presidency in 1952, on the backs of evangelical support. Preachers like Billy Graham come out and say that Dwight Eisenhower is going to reflect this Christian nation that we are trying to become. And Dwight Eisenhower rewards that support by doing things like making one nation under God the national motto, adding that to the pledge, one nation under God to the pledge, creating In God We Trust on the national currency. And so in many ways, Dwight Eisenhower embodied what scholars call ceremonial deism, where we believe in a religious identity for the nation, but we're not going to get into particulars. Eisenhower's famous quote is saying that our nation is based on religious belief. I don't care what that religious belief is. But during this time of this culmination of this Christian nationalist impulse, there was still a concern of, well, we don't want to see this turn into the rise of ecclesiastical leaders taking undue influence. We want a religious nation, but we don't want ecclesiastical leadership.
Because separation of church and state is still really important to us.
We have this anxiety to where we want religion to shape our politics, but we don't want the church to control the state. And so one of the ways to balance that was an amendment passed through Congress named after Lyndon Johnson, a senator from Texas at the time, saying that, religion is going to influence the way that people view society, including how they define their nation. But we don't want ecclesiastical leaders getting involved in politics. And this fulfills a long-standing American tradition to where as much as there's separation of church and state, which there never was full separation of church and state, but as much as there is a separation of church and state, that means we don't want ecclesiastical leaders infringing on the personal conscience of individual citizens. That citizens need to be able to choose based on their own agency, intellect, and interests, rather than what their clergymen tell them they should vote for.
So the Johnson Amendment passes, but does it even matter? I mean, one of the things that's interesting is it's rarely enforced now. it doesn't seem clear to me that people paid much attention to it before. And so it sounds like it's honored more in the breach than the observance.
Yeah, it's almost a symbolic sign for America. It's a way for Americans to still claim we're not a, theocracy. We're not allowing clergy to take control. But, there were still religious leaders throughout the ensuing 6 decades that continued to endorse politicians, both on the right and the left. You had Billy Graham continuing to endorse political candidates, appear with them on stage. Now, maybe he might not come out and specifically say, I endorsed Richard Nixon in 1968.
But you knew what he was talking about.
But he would say, hey, I support law and order, which there's only one candidate running on law and order. Yeah. Whereas at the same time, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, they're also endorsing political candidates. So the Johnson Amendment was always this symbol, but not always a reality in American religious practice.
You mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., and I think this conversation is often framed as something that conservatives are more likely to violate than progressives, but that's just not the case.
No, it's not. And I should emphasize it's not always the same degree, right? People like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, they'll say things like, I'm endorsing a cause. I'm endorsing equal rights. I'm endorsing voting equality. I'm not endorsing Lyndon Johnson as his presidential campaign. I'm endorsing these particular policies, which it just so happens Lyndon Johnson's the only one supporting on the national level. Yeah. But yeah, this has always been seen as a conservative measure, but has always been in practice a bipartisan activity where you have black churches throughout America busing their congregants to the voting polls to vote for their chosen candidates. You have Jeremiah Wright in 2008 endorsing his former congregant Barack Obama, which ends up raising some controversies because of Jeremiah Wright's own past teachings. Yeah. So I think this is something that is much more American than it is conservative in practice.
So if the Johnson Amendment was just sort of more a symbolic kind of statement and effort, what does it mean to get rid of it? What do you think? Does that matter? That thing is not there anymore. Whether it was practiced or not, whether it was observed or not, it's just not there anymore now.
Yeah, I remember hearing an expert say that only one church has been punished for violating the Johnson Act in the last 4 decades, which is not a lot given the numerous violations of the Johnson Amendment that has just never really been practiced. I do think that removing the Johnson Amendment will remove at least an ideological check that some churches have been trying to follow, right? The LDS Church, as an example, has often said we don't endorse politicians because of the Johnson Amendment, and other churches have said this as well.
They cited it?
I don't know if they cite it, but they at least cite the practice of it, right? Because the symbol that the Johnson Amendment represents of churches not infringing on the personal conscience is something that has been involved. I don't think that it's going to change the political climate of America at all. I do think it might lead to some churches shifting in operations because they can now act as quasi-super PACs for political parties because now politicians can much more closely align with religious groups and clergy to shape it. So I don't think it's going to change American politics much, but I do think it can make some churches a bit more partisan.
Benjamin Park. He's an associate professor of history at Sam Houston State University. We'll take a break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we've been talking about this change in a tax rule from the IRS, which is way more interesting than it sounds. A few weeks ago, the IRS said it was now okay for pastors and leaders in churches to make endorsements of political candidates from the pulpit. So we're talking about how big a deal this change is. And we'll come to some larger questions here in a minute, but we've been talking to the historian Benjamin Park. And we wanted to know how all of this is playing out in the LDS Church, whether the rule change will make much of a difference, and whether in this church or in any other you can actually tease out politics from worship anymore. As we've said, LDS Church officials didn't offer a direct comment about the change, but it doesn't seem they're going to move away from their position of political neutrality. Now, you remember that story that Park told us at the beginning of the program about the Mormon leader J. Reuben Clark, who tried to get the Saints to vote against Roosevelt in the New Deal, and it didn't work, and Clark finds a workaround. So let's go back to that story. Here's Benjamin Park again. Let's talk a little bit about the Mormon history part of this. One of the arguments that you have made is that, and this seems kind of counterintuitive, that Latter-day Saints who in the 30s said they didn't in the 30s who were not paying attention to J. Reuben Clark and other leaders who said do not vote for FDR and went ahead and voted for FDR anyway. One of the things you've said is that eventually leads decades later to Mormons being really conservative. Make the case for that connection.
I think that one of the lessons that J. Reuben Clark and others took from the 1930s and 1940s is you can't just tell Latter-day Saints to vote for a certain party. That instead you have to lay the groundwork. You have to establish a culture. You have to establish a society where they are willing to follow along, because this shows the limits of prophetic intervention into political matters. That if you just tell someone that you need to do something, even in the Latter-day Saint tradition, with this long history of prophetic infallibility in a cultural mindset, they're not just going to vote in lockstep. So J. Reuben Clark just coming out and saying, you need to vote Republican, doesn't work. J. Reuben Clark shaping LDS curriculum and helping cultivate society in a conservative movement is going to work. So I think J. Reuben Clark realizes from the 1930s and 1940s is that we can't just tell the Latter-day Saints to vote against FDR. Instead, we need to raise the children. We need to structure LDS curriculum. We need to
write proclamations.
We need to write proclamations. We need to define moral issues in a way that in the future, Latter-day Saints will take the support for Republican Party as a given, which they eventually succeed in doing.
So in some ways, this idea of the IRS now changing the rules and allowing for political endorsements, the church can say, we're not going to endorse anybody because they don't have to.
Right. I think the church has learned over the years that, A, it's better to operate on public sphere without being seen as overtly partisan or overtly political, but also because they realize they don't need it. Latter-day Saints now are so overwhelmingly conservative in America that having to come out and say vote for a particular candidate, that's not necessary anymore.
The LDS Church is notoriously careful about its political neutrality. So just how deeply embedded in Mormonism is that? Because one of the things you mentioned to us is that Mormons used to vote in a block, and that got them in trouble.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest points of conflict for the LDS Church in the 19th century. Going back to Joseph Smith and Nauvoo, their block voting was what drew a lot of opposition from outside the faith. And then in Utah, the Mormons create their own political party, the People's Party. That's going to reflect their interests. They saw that was their only way to make sure that politicians were going to listen to them, is if we pool all our votes together. And that was seen as theocracy, as theocratic to the broader nation. And so when the broader nation explains why the Mormons aren't Americans, why we're not granting Utah statehood, they point to 1, polygamy, and 2, theocracy. And so when Mormons give up polygamy, at least publicly in 1890, that is soon followed by embracing the 2-party system, dissolving the People's Party, and doing this very awkward division between Republicans and Democrats in the 1890s that has a long and complicated history. But after the 1930s and 1940s and even 1950s, where you have several church leaders becoming explicit in their political participation, whether it be Ezra Taft Benson in the 1950s and endorsing right-wing politics, the Mormons recognize that this is not a great PR move, at least when trying to grain American assimilation, nor is it a good position for an increasingly global faith. In the 1950s and 60s, the First Presidency receives an increasing number of letters from church leaders in Europe and South America saying, hey, we don't really know what to do with Ezra Taft Benson using his General Conference address to denounce socialism, given we are a socialist nation. How does that really work? And so the church recognizes we need to decouple our discourse from American politics. At the same time, they start recognizing, well, if we can frame our interventions in a different way that doesn't seem overtly political, we can still shape LDS discourse and practice in ways that we believe still emphasizes morality. So for instance—
But isn't that the word?
Yeah.
We go away from it being political and we invoke the idea of morality.
By the 1980s, the church has solidified this concept of the church won't get involved in political issues. We remain politically neutral, but we can speak out on moral issues, which often revolves around marriage and gender. And that was the definition for speaking out against same-sex marriage. But it was also the justification used for the church speaking out on immigration for a number of years, that we can speak out on these moral issues while still maintaining our neutrality. And this was a very conscious decision by church leaders in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in part as they're starting to align with this new religious right coalition where evangelicals and right-wing Christian groups in America are starting to consolidate their support for the Republican Party, but wanting to define it in a way that works in a supposedly pluralistic society. Well, one way we can do that is we define it as moral issues rather than political.
You know, it's interesting. You have the question of whether or not the official hierarchy of the church should or shouldn't endorse a particular candidate. But what about in a church that is unique in the sense that it is managed by, at least on the local level, lay ministers?
Yeah.
Not that the church has an official position, but that people are always inclined to bring their politics to their Sunday school lessons or their talks. It's just a reflection of who they are. And if you don't agree with that particular political position, you find it off-putting. If you do, you find it courageous and inspiring.
Right. I think there's sometimes this lazy assumption that religion and politics operate in separate spheres, when in reality they have always been in conjoined. Your religious vision shapes the way that you view the world and your relationship to other people.
You can't tease them out.
Which means you can't talk about things like the Bible or the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants without revealing your political ideology. And you can see that in how teachers shape their lesson plans on Sundays, or even the curriculum coming from Salt Lake City. Is if you're going to define liberty in a certain way in your gospel doctrine class, that often reveals your political stance. Now, lots of people try to divorce their religious ideas from their partisan ideology, saying that my Sunday lessons are different from my Tuesday voting. But it's never fully inseparable. And the LDS Church's culture and theological discourse and the parameters of what's typically considered mainstream LDS Church has increasingly become more synonymous with conservative right-wing Republican ideas in America, which means that you can teach a gospel doctrine lesson, claim it's not partisan, but it still is going to reinforce a particular political worldview.
Because it has enough dog whistles, wink and a nod.
Right.
There's enough in there that people can discern, I know what you're talking about.
And I think the best example of this came during COVID, whereas the LDS Church for decades has emphasized this kind of trust in spiritual sources rather than secular authority, and a distrust toward these liberal elites and infringements on freedom, so that when COVID comes around and the very same authorities and government and officials who Latter-day Saints don't really trust because of this discourse has become prevalent are telling them to wear masks and get vaccinated. They're like, no, we've been warned. We've been prepared for this. We've been warned of this infringements on freedom. And so when LDS authorities come out and say, yeah, you should wear masks, you should get vaccinated, they're like, no. You've been telling us otherwise all these years. And so in many ways, that's an example of how the church has kind of sowed the wind and is now reaping the whirlwind, right? That there's been this conservative culture cultivated for decades that is not very easy to now dissuade.
Okay, so on that thought, there's often this question that comes up about whether or not Mormons are somehow unique or different. And I want to apply that question to this subject of political endorsements along the lines of what you were saying. Are Latter-day Saints different in terms of how they turn to their faith leaders for guidance about issues and politics than, say, the Southern Baptists might be or the Methodists might be?
Yeah. I think what we've been seeing over the last few decades is the erosion of the unique Mormon perspective, of Mormons being distinct from the broader Baptist, evangelical, Methodist perspectives in America, to where it used to be that there was this unique Mormon voting bloc that would follow their leaders. And this is often used to justify the Utah way of politics, that Mormons did politics a bit differently. But in the last decade or so, especially with the rise of MAGA dominating American right-wing politics, I think we're seeing Latter-day Saints operate much more in line with right-wing religious groups in America. Now, on the one hand, Latter-day Saints remain unique because they have an ecclesiastical institutional hierarchy that does not exist in many other churches. I mean, most Baptists don't listen to the Southern Baptist Convention on what their statements are.
It's local, super local,
it's very local.
Yeah.
But I think we see, especially in the Utah case, of the radicalization of the Utah Republican Party, showing that it's going beyond the confines, the limits that the ecclesiastical structure used to provide for Mormon politics. So I think we're seeing Mormon Republicans operate much more synonymously with Baptist Republicans than we did even a decade ago.
So this is new.
Yeah, I think it is. I think if we look at Mormon politics, the history of Mormon politics in the last couple decades, we're seeing the disappearance of a unique flavor of Mormon conservatism and the increasing rise of Mormons acting like the more radicalized Republican body in the broader American nation.
So we're talking with the divinity professor Esau McCauley about all of this. And one of the things he says is that, yes, it's true that faith communities have confronted injustice through what he describes as moral witness. He pays a lot of attention to the Black church, for example. We were talking earlier about, civil rights and the role that churches played in that. So the idea of a moral witness. But he says when you actually say the name of a candidate or maybe an issue, but you make a political endorsement, you print a pamphlet or whatever, that changes everything, that it fundamentally alters the nature of that sense of witness. What do you make of that?
I think that's a very modern invention of politics, right? I think in many ways it is a fulfillment of this longstanding tradition of ecclesiastical leaders should not do backroom agreements with politicians. So in many ways that's a longstanding issue. But we've seen the betrayal of those principles throughout American history writ large, that there has never been a point where churches were not involved in politics. Now, for a long time, they did not need to be explicit because the mainstream evangelical culture controlled America to such a degree that they did not have to speak out on politics because that was not necessary. But now I think we see a lot of people defining, especially on the American left, saying that, well, maybe it's time to move forward. Maybe the progressive stance is we are soiling our religious vision with this involvement in politics. And so, if anything, I think the repeal of the Johnson Amendment, if it moves to a repeal rather than just a non-enforcement, is going to further polarize this religious and political debate, with some saying that, well, how can religions actually speak to morality without getting involved with names and speaking out? That's the only way we can make a difference. With others saying that, no, actually that's a betrayal of our religious principles of neutrality as well as democracy. And so if anything, I think this new division of interpreting religion's role in the endorsement of politics is going to further exacerbate this partisan divide between religion and politics that has long been in existence but is only growing wider.
So I guess I would have concluded earlier in our conversation that you're thinking, this Johnson Amendment, looking the other way now on this Johnson Amendment thing, is not really going to change much in Mormonism because they already have a sort of settled trajectory. But I'm not sure you would say that now. I guess the question is, because I think a lot of people are saying, it's not really going to change anything in Mormonism. They have, they're politically neutral. That's embedded in who they are. They're not going to. That's not going to change.
Right.
But where are you?
So it's a good point, and it shows this divided notion of the topic in America in general. I think it's not going to change the institutional church at all, because the institutional church is not going to come out and endorse candidates.
Right.
But the Mormon community, the culture, as experienced at the local level, I think it's going to further inflame these partisan divides. Now, I don't think bishops are going to get up and endorse candidates because they would be released, because I think the church is genuine in trying to respect this political neutrality. But I think the erosion of the Johnson Amendment is going to provide further evidence to a lot of Latter-day Saints, justifying their merging of political and religious identities. And so I think it's not going to change the institution, but it's going to further inflame the partisan culture.
Benjamin Park, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
That's Benjamin Park. He's an associate professor of history at Sam Houston State University. His most recent book is American Zion, A New History of Mormonism. His YouTube channel is Professor Benjamin Park. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we've been talking about what happens now that the IRS says churches can endorse political candidates during their services. What does this change in tax law mean for religious life in the country? Well, Father Esau McCauley is worried about it. McCauley is an Anglican priest and a professor at Wheaton College, and he recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic where he said, if you give clergy a role as political gatekeepers, you could undermine their spiritual authority, but you could also reduce the church to just another political arena. McCauley grew up in the black church, and he says in his piece, politicians often would show up there looking for support, but he said his pastor managed to keep a critical distance.
One of the things that people should understand is that historically, the black church played a unique role in African-American culture because they were out of slavery, the most educated members of the community. They're the first people who were actually elected to Congress. They were black church pastors. And they were the few people who were economically independent from the white power structure. And so you couldn't fire the black pastor because he was funded by black income. And so if you wanted to speak to the community, the black community, you had to go to black churches. It was the one place we all gathered in one place. And so for that reason, historically, politicians have always come into black churches. And it's always been incumbent upon the black pastor to say things that other people couldn't say about what was happening in society. And so during the civil rights movement, you would see a lot of the people who were leaders in the civil rights movement were actually clergy. And so they would often be politically engaged. And so there was an issue that people had to address. They would deal with the issue itself. Police brutality, economic exploitation, segregation, inequality. So issues were always addressed both in the pulpit and in the community by pastors. So my pastor did that. So it was politically active in that regard. We were always marching and doing stuff, talking to City Hall. But when it came to an actual politician who would come to the congregation, they would just show up to let people know that we cared about the community. And the pastor would say, I see you, you were here. And if you have a question about what I think about this person in particular, ask me outside of the pulpit. And the pastor knew that in church, it was an opportunity to obviously speak about how the things of God related to the lives that people lived. But he didn't think it was the time to directly encourage people to vote for a particular candidate.
So he would have been crossing a line if he had said the name of a particular candidate. That was the place you guys knew where he was coming from. Yeah. Because at the coffee klatch later, he would freely say it, but for some reason the pulpit was off limits and he would have been crossing a line if he had done it there.
The funny part is, I don't think my pastor never actually said it. It was just, we knew. I'm sorry, this is Huntsville, Alabama in the 80s and the 90s. And this is the black part of Huntsville, Alabama. It was all Democrats. I'm just going to be completely honest. It was all Democrats. So it wasn't like a confusion as to who they voted for. It was just like he just didn't think it was his job in that place to say, vote for the Democrat or vote for the Republican.
So in some ways, this is about what is the role of the pastor of a church? What's their job? Not that they don't have opinions, but that they have opinions in a certain place. Is that part of it?
I think that it's almost how much control does the clergy have over the lives of people? We have to think about this very practically. We often think about this in regards to like a presidential election. Should you vote for this president or that presidential candidate? But elections go all the way down, to the school board, to the mayor, to the city council, to the comptroller. And if you just give your congregations a list of all of the people about who to vote for, then that's taking a role in the lives of people and their ability to make decisions for themselves to go beyond the role of what a clergy is supposed to do. Now, a clergy can say that as a Christian, we ought to be concerned, or a person of faith, but in my context as Christian, that you ought to be concerned about this issue. Let's say, for example, I remember the Flint water crisis, or the way that people are being treated, like the way the immigrants are being treated in the United States.
Yeah.
There's not two sides of whether or not we should just put people in cages. And so there is a place for clergy to speak prophetically about issues. But there's a million different ways as to how these issues are cashed out. And it's beyond the competence of clergy to expect us to understand and be able to implement policies in a bunch of different ways. Like I'm not an expert on immigration policy. I'm not an expert on tax policies. I'm not an expert on tariffs. And so if it's my job at every moment to not just think about broad issues of justice and righteousness, but to create a policy in my head that I think that all Christians must agree to, and then tell my congregation to do that, that's a totalitarian type of control that I don't think is appropriate for clergy.
I want to push back a little bit on the idea of the difference between bearing witness against unjust laws and endorsing a candidate. Now, let's say there's a candidate that may have a record of supporting or wanting to implement unjust laws, or be perceived as doing something more than just, an advocate for a particular political policy or political ideology. Let's not dance around it. What I would just call the kind of Trump exemption. I mean, you could say objectively, I think it'd be fair to say that there are some parts of his character that are morally questionable. And so wouldn't it matter for the good of the country, or just providing guidance for the moral interest of the world in which your congregation lives, to offer them some sort of warning or guidance by endorsing someone else or saying maybe you shouldn't vote for this person? Do you know what I mean?
Yes. And this may seem to be splitting hairs, but I actually think it is important. Let's say, for example, I'm sitting in Germany and Hitler's running for office, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing to say that we believe that Hitler is morally unfit for, office. That actually gives the believer a bunch of different options. They could choose not to vote. I don't know the system of how Germany works. They could choose to vote for a third party. They can choose to write in a candidate. And so I actually think there's a moral distinction between declaring one person unfit and another person as the only other alternative. Because there's a possibility of people deciding not to vote. There's a possibility of people voting for third party. And so I do think that, once again, we have to leave space for moral discernment. And one of the things that I want to say is that it's almost like, okay, right now we have like the supreme gathering of power in the presidency right now.
Yeah.
Where like all of these norms are being taken down. And a lot of people who are in the Republican Party is like, this is great. He can do whatever he wants to do. But that same kind of power, if it was in Democratic hands, is going to look a lot different. And so what I want to say is, whenever we feel like the moment requires an exception that could then become dangerous in the future, then I want to be hesitant about making that exception the rule. So you might say, in this particular circumstance, we need to be able to endorse candidates. But the problem is, I see people saying all of the time, every election is the most important election of our lives. And in this particular election, we have to endorse like a particular candidate. I'm not saying this is not a unique moment in time. I'm saying that gets more complicated than you see. And once again, do we actually want clergy making that discernment on their own. Like if you're in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Ohio, there are churches there with 5, 10, 20,000 members in it. And if that person makes that endorsement in a swing state, that could decide elections. And do we actually want the pressure on pastors in October or September or November of election years to have 5 to 10 pastors deciding elections? I don't think that's the role of clergy.
It brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier, what you describe as the conscience and liberty of lay people, the idea of protecting the agency of your congregation. And you write about this as it being a really important Christian teaching that, as you put it, all humans are made in the image of God and can understand and follow his will themselves. The idea of them working it out themselves, that's the teaching that you're talking about here that's important?
I think you have to give people freedom. I mean, I'm sorry, this might sound like silly. One of my favorite books is The Lord of the Rings. And one of the central theses of The Lord of the Rings is, what do you do with power? You give it away. And that even if you think you can use the power and it not corrupt you, it always corrupts you. And I think that the more power that we accrue to ourselves as clergy, the more damage we do when we misuse that power. And so the healthiest thing that I would say I can do is to say, here's how I understand what God is calling us to. I want to impress these things upon your consciences and then implore you to do the same. I mean, one of the things that makes Christianity, when it's at its best, unique, is that it functions by moral persuasion. That we don't force people to agree with us. That part of being in a democracy is to say, here are these ideas. I think these ideas can make society better. What do you think of them? And so I just don't think we should create a culture where that is taken away from people. I do not want to be able to demand or enforce my views upon other people. I can just say this is the truth as best as I can understand it, commend it to the consciences, both of my congregation and anybody who reads my work.
You know, there's something that you write about that it seems to be what has happened in the political environment over the last few decades, like what it's done to the church and the experience of going to church. I mean, you talked about how because people who go to church now, they kind of know what they're going to get from the pulpit. Like if they're liberal, you know, they've made a choice to be there because that resonates with them. If they're conservative, same thing. And you've said what happens is that people are, and this is how you put it, are no longer required to listen to the actual moral voice. What do you mean by that?
You know, there was a time a long time ago when the question was, could you marry across like religious difference?
Yeah.
And I think now the issue is, can you imagine being married across from political difference?
Right.
And so we are so alienated from one another. We can't understand one another and understand each other's arguments and how we see the world. And the church is actually one of those places that, at least in principle, we come together and we say there's a higher good or a higher truth than our political allegiances. And there's a God who challenges both the left and the right. And part of being in church is supposed to be uncomfortable. And if we put ourselves in communities where we're not uncomfortable, then we just lose this chance of, it's one of the few things that still unite us as a country.
It kind of raises the question of how a church community works or gets together. Like in making the exemption change, the IRS said that these pastoral endorsements are like a family having a discussion about the candidates. But you don't think that's right. Like that's not what's going on.
That's not even close to being true. What I'm saying is, like, families don't broadcast their views to 10,000 people. So in my family, we go and we have a family argument over dinner, but it's contained to 5, 10, 20 people at the most. Like our Thanksgiving dinner is not streamed on Facebook. And churches have social media. Churches have YouTube accounts. Churches collect money. All of these things are related. No one's paying me money to go into my family and then endorse someone. What's to stop a political candidate from saying, I'm going to give $50,000 for this church to build its gymnasium. And, the pastor also happened to endorse me. Yeah. So I think that calling this a family dinner doesn't take seriously the financial incentive that's going to happen in churches and the political pressure that pastors are going to be able to present on churches. And once churches begin to endorse candidates, you know what they also become? Centers of protest. And so what happens when they endorse a candidate and now you have the other side marching around the congregation saying, hey, why did you endorse this person? And so I think there are knock-on effects of churches making public decisions that are radically different than what happens when individuals make those decisions in their family.
Mm. We were talking off air a moment ago about your recent trip to London where you saw a few plays, and one of them was the Robert Bolt play, A Man for All Seasons. It's that story of Thomas More who runs afoul of Henry VIII because More will not endorse Henry VIII leaving, the Catholic Church to marry this new wife, Anne Boleyn, and he loses his head because of it. And More, as he's being executed, one of the last things he says is that he is the king's good servant. But then he says, but I'm God's first. Will you talk a little bit about that? Because you've written in your piece that the church is most useful to the state when it reminds the government of the limits of its authority.
I wish we were doing a review of A Man for All Seasons, because one of the interesting things about Thomas More, it is that Thomas More refused to comment on the issues of the day.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that he directly opposed the president. It's the fact that he didn't get on board.
Yeah.
And his silence spoke loudly. And that's what I mean. So that's really interesting in this conversation. But the second thing that I want to say about that is what I think makes the church dangerous, or what made Thomas More such a dangerous character, and why actually Henry wanted to get him on side, is that people believed in Thomas More's integrity.
Yeah.
And the king knew that if Thomas said it, that people would believe that Thomas is actually saying what he actually believed. And there's other people who are just going to shift in the wind. And so he had to make in his moral calculus, I don't have this man in my pocket. And what I would say, what makes the church dangerous is that if a politician has to make this moral calculus, if we do this to the poor, if we do this to the neglected, if we participate in this violence abroad, I would have to deal with the Christians. And instead of saying, how would this impact my base that I already have on my agenda because I gave them something, 2 years ago, I would like it a politician had to answer this question. Is it right or is it wrong? And if it's wrong, then I can expect the church to resist me. And so what I'm talking about is an unpredictable church. And right now, I just don't feel like the church is unpredictable. I think that people know that, one portion of the church is going to go this way, mm-hmm. and another part of the church is going to go the other way. And so what I really want the church to be is to be dangerous, because the government always thinks it's better at governing than it actually is. People have reduced the church merely to another player in this partisan game. And I want to say there's a bigger game at play. And I hope that the churches will continue to understand this, that we don't just need a slice of the remnants of whatever power whoever's in charge is going to give us, that we answer to a different and higher calling. And that means that sometimes we're mad at Republicans, sometimes we're mad at Democrats, but hopefully we're always oriented towards the truth.
Will this change things?
I think it's going to have a negative impact on the church. For example, if someone says to me, why don't I endorse a candidate? I used to be able to say it's illegal. And so I think that now there's going to be a lot more people who are going to opt in or opt out to churches based upon their public political affiliations.
Yeah. So you think people will leave the church?
Yeah. And also think the money that's going to come into the churches, I don't know the long-term financial implications of it, but what is to prevent a politician from donating to the church with the assumption that that church is going to endorse them? So I just think it's going to be money, power, and religion are going to be mixed in a way that I don't think are healthy. And I don't think it's going to benefit the church in the long run.
In your writing, you said that you hope pastors and churches will resist this temptation to endorse candidates and be more political. And that seems like the right word, because it makes me wonder, it seems in this time period that it's almost irresistible not to jump in.
There are not a lot of New York Times columnists who also pastor congregations. And so every single time I write something, I am resisting the temptation to go full partisan. And so maybe that's the reason why I'm so hesitant about it, because it feels like it's such an easy shortcut. But to leave moral space for people to disagree with me and to leave open the possibility that I could be wrong, and to constantly not set aside my convictions about the role of the church because of the urgency of the moment is a temptation that I deal with every day. And I think that that's true of other clergy as well. And I'm hoping that we are able to resist that temptation.
Esau McCauley, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd love to come back sometime.
Esau McCauley. He's a pastor and a public theologian and associate professor of the New Testament at Wheaton College. His latest book is called God's Colorful Kingdom. We'll put a link to his piece in The Atlantic on our website, radiowest.org. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. We're on Instagram at Radio West. Or you can just email us at radiowest@kuer.org. The program is produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.